Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, we all know that this 2016 presidential election cycle has been a huge fiasco. Many people say that they've never seen a divisive election cycle like this, and we ourselves here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have oftentimes reiterated on previous episodes that it is, in fact, the most heated, contested, and personalized election cycle of all living memory. That being said, history does show us that there have been election cycles which have been heated and contentious before. In fact, just as divisive, if not even more so, than the ones we're seeing now. Because one of the things that we've heard reiterated time and again throughout both the primary process and now the process leading up to the general election cycle slated for the first week of November is that the Republican Party is divided. It is divided in a way that will ensure that it will fall to inevitable defeat in the general election cycle. And of course, everyone is sitting there trying to figure this out. They're trying to point the fingers at somebody and say, look, this is the cause that led to the division of the base of the Gutless Opposition Party, or GOP, and it is their fault. But again, it's actually something that has been in the works for well over a century now. You know, I've mentioned that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have been pushing for their twisted machinations for well over a century and a half now, and that they have couched their positions in a movement known as the American Progressive Movement. But the American Progressive Movement actually traces its origins back to former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt and the opening decades of the 20th century. So what we're seeing actually is a bit of a mirror image or a reflection of what happened in this nation about a century ago. We know that, or actually a century and 10 years, so about 110 to 112 or 114 years ago. To really understand where it goes, we have to go back to what Theodore Roosevelt was pushing during his 2 terms of office as President of the United States. Roosevelt had never once been really slated for the presidency. In fact, they shoved him into the position of vice president during the election of William McKinley because it was in the hopes that such a powerless office would render Roosevelt's ascension in the arena of American politics as null and void. They simply wanted to make it a moot point, something that would not become a specter that would haunt them with the real reins of political power. Of course, the they that I speak of was at that time the leadership of the Republican Party. You see, at the turn of the 20th century, the Republican Party was in the midst of a division, a great division like what they're facing right now in the midst of this 2016 presidential election cycle. There was a conservative group that was leading it. And in fact, it was the progressives that felt that they were the ones being slighted by what they termed and deemed the corrupt conservative wing of the Republican Party. This was during the era of the robber baron, and Roosevelt wanted to get rid of monopolies because he didn't believe that anything should challenge the government. Of course, at that time, William McKinley was still exceedingly interested in the traditional business roots and interests that had fueled both of the mainstay political parties at that time. Of course, with the assassination of William McKinley, the worst nightmare of the then conservative wing of the Republican Party came to fruition as Theodore Roosevelt, the up-and-coming progressive leader, became president of these United States of America. And during that time, he had selected to be his protege, the one that he would handpick to be his successor, in an Ohio judge named William Howard Taft. You see, he was grooming Taft to be his replacement after his 2 terms, because he was thinking at the time that he would follow the tradition that had been established by the father of this nation, George Washington, in only serving 2 terms. But during the 2 terms of the Roosevelt presidency, he pushed the Sherman Antitrust Act. He went after the quote-unquote robber barons and attempted to redefine the business and political landscape of the United States with one swell swoop of a pen. And of course, that placed the nation in a rather precarious position, because all of a sudden he was tinkering with expanding in exponential fashion the power wielded and exhibited by the federal government. But when you go back to the foundational documents, and in particular the supreme law of the land, which pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, is none other than our shared United States Constitution, you see that the federal government is one to be expressly limited. It must trace any and all of its governing authority back to a power which has been specifically enumerated unto it within the 4 corners of the Constitution. Well, Roosevelt didn't like that. Roosevelt didn't like that because he thought it severely crippled the power of government. Well, of course, it did exactly that. Our founding fathers had designed the Constitution and the 3 branches of government to operate in such a form and fashion as to prevent one singular entity, individual, and yes, even branch of government from consolidating the amount of political authority to control everything within the government. Recall that during that long, drawn-out, and bloody affair known as the American War of Independence, our founding fathers were rebelling and revolting against the centralized power of king and parliament. That was something that they thought was inherently wicked, something that must be overcome, and the only way to overcome it would be to wrest power into the hands of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty. Of course, you find that in the opening lines to the preamble to the United States Constitution, when it says that we, the people of the United States of America, in order to establish a more perfect union, to support the domestic tranquility, and to secure our peace, and to secure the blessings of liberties for posterity, that shows that we, the people, are the ones that delegated all forms and facets of power and control to the federal government. So it was based on a contract, but Roosevelt didn't want to be inhibited or impeded by some archaic contract. In fact, he was the one that coined the term progressive. He said that progress required us to go against the Constitution, which served its purpose during its inception. But now, in the fast-paced modern world of the early 20th century, we had to abandon something that was so wholly out of place in such a fast-paced modern society. And so the Republican Party had broken up into 2 competing and disparate factions. And in fact, by the year 1912, it represented the first time that significant numbers of delegates to the national conventions had been elected in a presidential preference primary. These primary elections were advocated by none other than the progressive faction of the Republican Party. Recall that during the times that the current gutless opposition party, or GOP, nominee Donald J. Trump said that the system was rigged against him, I was pointing out to how he, who has espoused progressive values and views for the vast majority of the 70 years that he spent on God's green earth, was actually rebelling against a system that his own mindset and philosophy had established during the turn of the 20th century. That was what is so laughable about what Trump is doing. But going back to 1912, we know that these primary elections were advocated for by the progressive faction of the Republican Party. They wanted to break the control of political parties by bosses. Altogether, we know that 12 states held Republican primaries, and that Robert M. La Follette won 2 of the first 4 primaries, which were North Dakota and Wisconsin. Beginning with his runaway victory in Illinois on April 9th, however, Teddy Roosevelt won 9 of the last 10 presidential primaries, and they were in the order as follows: Illinois, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Oregon, Maryland, California, Ohio, New Jersey, and South Dakota, losing only Massachusetts to his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. Now, this was a sign of his great popularity. Roosevelt had carried Taft's home state of Ohio. There were those who were claiming that the sitting president, William Howard Taft, should drop out of the race because he couldn't even win his home state. This marks quite an interesting reflection that we can draw in connection with the 2016 presidential election cycle. Recall that the Ohio governor, John Kasich, only managed to secure his home state, that of Ohio. But because he had managed to secure it, he said that that was the reason that he was going to continue in the presidential primary process for the GOP. Of course, what it shows is this sort of contentious muckraking, for lack of a better term, which actually got its start during the 1912 election, is just par for the course. It's something that had started during that 1912 election and has reared its ugly head in the 2016 presidential election cycle. Because just as it was in 1912, the Republican Party is split into two disparate and competing factions. The conservative movement is under attack from all sides, including from within the party that has been their home at least since the 1964 presidential election process. But what it shows, above all else, is that when we fail to learn from the lessons of our past, when we fail to learn from the past, then we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. And I believe that that's what we're seeing right now. But what's so amazing is Taft, as I had mentioned, had been a very staunch friend of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had picked him to succeed him in the office of president. After the first term of William Howard Taft, Roosevelt had gone to safari in Africa and was awaiting a letter from Taft to have him campaign for him upon his return. Taft, however, thought that he would hear first from Roosevelt, so he didn't write a letter to his mentor. This allegedly made Roosevelt exceedingly angry. He was seething with rage, and he decided that it was his turn to try and throw his hat in the ring again for the 1912 election. And the reason he said behind all of this was that Taft was not doing enough to be for the progressive movement. He thought he wasn't a staunch enough progressive, and therefore Roosevelt had decided that he would challenge his friend. This deeply wounded Taft, who thought that his friendship with Roosevelt could survive anything. But Roosevelt went out of his way to claim that Taft had been bought by the banking industry or interests and also by big business interests. And if you think about that, that almost sounds like the same type of malarkey and nonsense that we heard thrown against any candidate who wasn't Donald J. Trump all throughout the primary process. Well, again, this shows that history really explains the danger of populist and progressive movements. Because when you stop and think about it, in an objective form, the progressives were always about destroying the societal fabric and framework of these United States of America, and they were willing to stop at nothing to achieve their dark, diabolical, and dare I say, twisted machinations and goals. Roosevelt was the one that decided that he would create a new party when he failed to secure the support of important and prominent Republican leaders, thereby allowing Taft to still secure the nomination for the Republican Party. Roosevelt took the progressive wing of the Republican Party and created what was known in common parlance as the Bull Moose Party, but which had the official name of the American Progressive Party. So we see from this movement, what Roosevelt was doing was splitting the Republican Party, much as Donald J. Trump is splitting the Republican Party. We see that Taft didn't want to have to fight his old friend and the man who had been his closest confidant for well over a decade at that point, and who really didn't even like the office of President of the United States. He had come from the judiciary. His mind was that of a lawyer. He was more interested in being a judge than he was the chief executive of the United States of America. But he swiftly came to the conclusion that Roosevelt was a danger, a direct threat to our representative Republican form of government as codified, outlined, defined, and mandated by the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. And therefore, he took a noble stance. He knew he was going to lose, but he decided that his political career was less important than securing our representative Republican form of government. I think that that was a step that we need to applaud. It shows that even in dire times, when the United States was facing a new threat, that of progressivism and socialism, the leadership at that time, at least under William Howard Taft, was one based on principles, based on the foundational bedrock notions of the natural law tenets that underpin both our republic and our Constitution. And that's something that's so important to reflect upon, because that is something that is sorely missing in this 2016 presidential election cycle. Yes, you had a very divisive political environment gripping the hearts, souls, and minds of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people, at that time, just as you do today. You see, we haven't changed that much. The problems that we are facing also have not changed that much. It is something that continues to haunt us as I sit here and speak into this microphone, conveying this message unto you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members. But above all, it shows that the notion that we no longer have to worry about principles is bumpkus. It's bumpkus because if we want to maintain this nation, if we want to ever place this nation back onto the path of prosperity, then we are going to have to come together and stand on our values and our principles. In other words, we have to get back to basics. And as we have oftentimes reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, basics in this country is none other than our Constitution, which happens to be the supreme law of the land. It is really that cut and dry. But in 1912, we had someone that was willing to do that. We know that the Republican Convention was held in Chicago of 1912 from June 18th to 22nd. Taft had begun to gather delegates before this point, and the delegates chosen in the primaries served as a minority. Taft had the support of the bulk of the party organizations in the southern states. But it's important to note that these states had voted steadily Democrat in every presidential election since that of 1880. Roosevelt objected that they were given 1/4 of the delegates when they would contribute nothing to a Republican victory. As it turned out, delegates from the former Confederate states supported Taft by a 5-to-1 margin. Now, that too should sound a little bit familiar. The states that overwhelmingly supported Trump were mostly those like New York and, yes, even some of the old southern states. Now, the main difference between the 1912 election and that of 2016 is that the southern states have voted primarily for the Republican Party for decades now. This is a little bit of a difference, but it goes to show that, like in the states of New York and Massachusetts and where have you, that Trump was doing well and was getting a large share of the delegates throughout the primary process. These are states that usually vote blue, and they were given far more delegate coverage than other states. And it goes to show that that argument has continued. One that existed at the time of the 1912 election continues to play out in this fiasco and debacle of a 2016 presidential election cycle as well. These are the sorts of things that simply cannot be ignored. And it goes to show that the heated and contentious primary process, which actually got its start in 1912, is not that different than what we see unfurling before our very eyes in this 2016 presidential election cycle. Again, showing that history has not changed that much with respect to the way that the primary process works. However, when it came time for the convention to gather, Roosevelt challenged the credentials of nearly half of the delegates. By that time, however, it was too late. The delegates chose Elihu Root, once Roosevelt's top ally, to serve as chairman of the convention. Afterwards, the delegates seated Taft delegations in Alabama, Arizona, and California on tight votes of 597 to 472, 564 to 497, and 542 to 529, respectively. After losing California, where Roosevelt had won the primary, the progressive delegates gave up hope. They voted present on most succeeding roll calls. Not since the 1872 election had there been a major schism in the Republican Party. So you see, folks, this whole notion of a divided Republican Party is certainly not something new. It's something that we have encountered numerous times in the relatively brief yet illustrious history of the United States of America. And again, it shows that the past can tell us exactly how some election cycle might progress. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and we won't know exactly how things will turn out, but we can certainly turn to the past to see these glaring similarities and to point out that we have been in such a precarious position before. It's not something that should be a henny penny, the sky is falling, our entire electoral process is doomed. Rather, we should pay attention to what matters. We should see what things have played out like this in the past, and from there we can make whatever determinations are necessary to ensure that the conservative movement has a future. The other striking difference that we can take away from the 2016 presidential election cycle is that we don't have a candidate other than Evan McMullin who is trying to spearhead a movement to pull away conservatives from the Republican Party. Roosevelt had based his entire notion and argument for establishing the American Progressive Party, or Bull Moose Party, on this idea that the Republican Party, or GOP, had been rank with corruption. Certainly we've seen corruption in this cycle too, but that was merely an ulterior motive on the part of Roosevelt, something to use as subterfuge, to obfuscate the truth, to lead the party into believing that what he was doing was something good. And in fact, Roosevelt had managed to secure such a following that the Democrat challenger of Woodrow Wilson didn't even focus much of his attention on the Republican nominee, and instead spent most of his time attacking Roosevelt throughout the election process, saying that Roosevelt wasn't really a progressive. So we see that by 1912, the progressives were already sinking their claws into the body politic of the United States of America. They were seeking to transform the nation away from being a constitutionally endowed, representative Republican form of government into some dark and twisted, frothing at the mouth, Fabian socialist leftist dystopia. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly the dark and twisted scenario that we're facing right now in this 2016 presidential election cycle. It's one of those things we simply cannot ignore because it is repeating itself. We are seeing the same things that we saw during 1912. And if we are going to take the lessons from the past, we also have to realize that it was just a disgusting sort of thing. To give you an idea of how Roosevelt was, he was unable to tolerate the personal humiliation he suffered at the hands of Taft and the Old Guard. Notice that Old Guard language again. We hear that with the supposed establishment wing of the Gutless Opposition Party, or GOP. And therefore, Roosevelt refused to entertain the possibility of they refused to entertain the possibility of a compromise candidate, Roosevelt decided to strike back hard. On June 22, 1912, Roosevelt asked his supporters to leave the convention. Roosevelt maintained that President Taft had allowed fraudulent seating of delegates to capture the presidential nomination from progressive forces within the party. Thus, with the support of convention chairman Elihu Root, Taft's supporters outvoted Roosevelt's men, and the convention re-nominated incumbents William Howard Taft and James S. Sherman, making Sherman the first sitting vice president to be nominated for re-election since John C. Calhoun all the way back in 1828. Now, does that sound a bit familiar? Yes, we didn't have a sitting president at the time, but we did have the sorts of fraudulent concerns that were occurring on the convention floor there in Cleveland, Ohio, back in July with respect to RNC chairman Rents and Repeatus. As you see, it's the same sort of bitterness playing itself out again as it did some 104 years ago. So the Republican Party is in the same position that it was some 104 years ago. And that is staggering when you stop and consider that we are fighting against progressives, and that it is now the progressive wing of the Republican Party that is the mainstay, and rather the so-called old guard or conservatives that have been pushed out to the sidelines. So you see, the roles are reversed, but the scenario is much the same. It is nothing new under the sun, as the old adage goes. What we are facing here is politics as usual. But it's more destructive than in the past. This would have been Roosevelt securing the nomination, because Donald J. Trump carries the same sort of views that Theodore Roosevelt did. And let's not forget that Roosevelt had been a powerful force within New York. He had been the police commissioner of New York City. So we see also that connection plays out as well. The Ohio connection is there as well. Everything plays out the way that it is. And it shows that the political questions and tribulations that currently face this nation have been facing us for a very long time. And it also shows that we have been divorcing and distancing ourselves from the tenets contained within the four corners of our Constitution for over a century as well. And again, on top of all of that, what really will place this nation back onto the path to prosperity is for we, the people, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, to come together standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and unity to say that we won't allow them to redefine us, that we won't allow conservatism to be utterly annihilated by these dark and maniacal forces of progressivism, that the people like Rents and Repeatus and the nominee Donald J. Trump do not represent our values. Sure, we could spend all sorts of time talking about the disaster that is Hillary Rotten Clinton, but we know who she is. We know the dangers that she represents and poses. We know that we will have to fight her. The problem is, when our own party nominates a man who sits there and says it's the Republican Party, not the Conservative Party, and says that he would rather reach out to disenfranchised socialist voters for disgraced presidential candidate, nerd-faced Bernie Sanders, it shows that we have a major problem within our own party. It's as though there is a raging inferno within our own house, and yes, there are bandits, crooks, and thieves surrounding the entire premises of our property. But the greatest threat is that of the fire. We must subdue the fire first, then we can deal with the other problems. Donald J. Trump is clearly a man who is not qualified to wield the reins of political power in the United States of America. I wish that weren't so. I wish that the party had decided to nominate someone who was truly electable, but no, we decided not to. We decided to turn our back on the Constitution yet again. So this will be the third presidential election cycle in a row that conservatism has been snubbed by the political powers that be within the gutless opposition party, or GOP. And I do not believe that is something we can tolerate. It is not something that can stand in this nation because it threatens all that we hold near and dear. But of course, you're not going to hear this from the mainstream media. They don't want to dig that far back into the past. That means that they would have to expose the true shortcomings of their twisted and diabolical propagandistic narrative and agenda. And as we all know, they will never do that because they know that their ideas cannot compete in a free marketplace of ideas. Another area where the 2016 presidential election cycle seems to mirror that of the 1912 is this idea of a backlash against the so-called establishment wing of the gutless opposition party, or GOP. We see that Roosevelt had decided that after he failed to secure the nomination in the Chicago-based Republican National Convention of that year, that he decided that he would go forth and create a new party. The Republican progressives reconvened in Chicago and endorsed the formation of a national progressive party. When formally launched that summer, the new Progressive Party chose Roosevelt as its presidential nominee and Governor Hiram Johnson of California as his running mate. When questioned by reporters, Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose, and henceforth the party was stuck with the moniker of the Bull Moose Party. And of course, the progressives promised to increase federal regulation and protect the welfare of ordinary people. So as you can see, folks, we already had this type of divisive mindset that we see pushed forth by the part of the progressives as early as 1912. This is why Theodore Roosevelt is known as the father of the American Progressive Party. So it had its origins 104 years ago, and they were basically attempting to push the same thing that they're pushing now, that of increased governmental control at the expense of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people. And of course, at that time, the Democrats were pushing for progressivism as well. We had Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey becoming the leader of the Democrat Party. Their convention was held in Baltimore, Maryland from June 25th to July 2nd. And it was one of the more memorable presidential conventions of the 20th century. Initially, the frontrunner appeared to be Champ Clark of Missouri, who was the sitting Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Clark had received the largest number of delegates from early ballots. However, he was unable to get 2/3 of the vote required to win the nomination. His chances were hurt when Tammany Hall, which was the powerful and corrupt Democrat political machine of New York, once again another New York connection, threw its support behind Clark. Instead of helping him, this led William Jennings Bryan, who had also attempted to run in 1896 on the populist ticket, the three-time Democrat presidential candidate, in fact, and still the leader of the party's liberals, to turn against Clark as the candidate of Wall Street. So already we see that some of the same themes and scenarios that have been dominant throughout this 2016 presidential election cycle were first being reared in the election of 1912. It shows that the nation is in just as dark and turbulent political waters as it was some 104 years ago. And to me, that speaks volumes about how we have failed to learn from the lessons of the past and are thereby doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. In fact, I think this entire 2016 presidential election cycle is a repeat of these failed presidential runs. They are failed because when you stop and think about it, they are embracing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Folks, that is the clinical definition of insanity. There's no way around it. It is rearing its ugly head again in the arena of modern American politics. But it shows that they were pushing for it as early as then. Now, Bryan threw his weight and support to New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson, who had consistently finished second to Clark on each ballot and who was regarded as a quote-unquote moderate reformer. Again, we hear that kind of language here with respect to Hillary Clinton. She is moderate in so much as she is less frothing at the mouth than nerdface Burn Me Sanders was. And therefore, she was able to secure the nomination of the DNC. That means that we have two progressives pitted against one another in 2016, just as it was literally two progressives and one ineffectual conservative, for lack of a better term, in William Howard Taft running for the Republican Party. So literally, in 1912, you had a third party that was playing a bigger role than one of the two mainstay political parties vying for the highest office in the land. Now that's where it's a bit different in the 2016 presidential election cycle. We know that the third parties are not faring that well. Of course, this should be the election cycle in which the third parties are able to flex their political muscles, but they have put up ineffectual candidates as well. Gary Johnson is the furthest thing from a libertarian that one can possibly imagine. Then there's Darrell Castle with the alleged constitutional party that is not really garnering all that many votes. And then, of course, we have the even worse damn near communist candidate of Jill Stein with the Green Party. None of these parties are playing out in an effective fashion. The interesting one to watch here is Evan McMullen, who is running as an independent and who is backed by the funding of the Koch brothers. But when we look at who funded the Progressive Party, this should be kind of interesting as well, because it was basically supported and funded by J.P. Morgan, the financier, and the International Harvester Tractor Company. So you see, isn't it interesting? The ones that are trying to say that they were against big business or that they were against the quote-unquote Wall Street conglomeration of that time were primarily supported by a large publicly traded company. Well, it's kind of the same thing with the Democrats today. And it's kind of the same thing with Donald Trump. Yes, he's getting the support of certain companies, but he's also said that we need to back away from globalism. Yet it is these companies that want global markets. And free trade is certainly a good thing, but Donald Trump doesn't believe so. Trump wants to return to these failed policies of implementing restrictive and retaliatory trade tariffs, something that always comes back to harm the consumer. And when you look at the way that the current American markets is structured, you will find that free trade is the only way that they can succeed. This will only cause more financial heartache and headaches for the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this nation, we the people. But of course, that's not something that gets much coverage. But in 1912, you also had a Socialist Party nomination. In Eugene V. Debs, who was a former state representative from Indiana. Now, isn't that interesting? Indiana. Well, we know that Indiana Governor Mike Pence is the one that is the vice presidential nominee for the mafioso quafioso. So Trump has Indiana's support, and we see that back then a socialist movement was being really pushed by the Indiana representative of Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs had a history with organized labor, the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies as they were known. He was one of their leaders. He was one of the ones that had championed their positions of collective bargaining positions as early as 1900 and again in 1904. But he was ultimately unable to stop the progressives in the Democrat Party. And it was Woodrow Wilson and his progressives that won ultimately in the election of 1912. We see that, again, a similar scenario is unfurling before our very eyes in this current presidential election cycle. The various forces and the disparate and competing factions that were vying for power 104 years ago are the very same political factions and forces that are vying for the reins of political power in the United States of America again in 2016. There's no way around this, folks. And it's fascinating to see how the pieces continue to fall into place, how we are still essentially going forth and repeating the same battles that we have seen for well over a century now. And of course, what it falls to is that there have been these factions working to further divide and divorce ourselves from the clear and concise language of our shared United States Constitution. And again, it is why my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, and I have so oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, that the solution for this, the key to all of this, is none other than our Constitution. That is the way to free the people from the chains and shackles of governmental tyranny, bondage, but above all, servitude, to allow the people to enact in their own capacities and with their own initiative to place this nation back onto the path to prosperity. Now, I know that's far easier said than it is actually done, but it is something that we must do if we ever hope to see the nation return to a position of prominence. It's going to require diligent efforts on the part of we the people, and it means that we have to hold these politicians accountable for their words, deeds, and actions. Sure, we say that this 2016 presidential election cycle has seen the destruction of long-standing friendships. We've seen divisiveness boil up to the surface in ways that were, we thought, previously unimaginable. Yet what the election of 1912 shows is that strong and powerful friendships were eroded away by personal animus and by twisted political agendas and narratives. The progressives were all about redefining the United States of America by attempting to further increase the power of the central government at the expense of the people. These are the very same strains that have become the dominant forces and the dominant voices of the 2016 presidential election cycle. And folks, it shows no signs of improving at any point in the foreseeable future. Therefore, we must be vigilant and wary with respect to all of this, because it plays out that the divisions that are starting now will be ones that shall be felt for generations to come. And of course, it is a truly sad position that we find ourselves in, because it was an avoidable one, except that we were not looking to avoid these divisive tactics and strategies. Instead, we were so fed up with the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism that we were willing to sell our principles away. But, as a recent Red State article mentioned, a lot of this ties into the whole notion that we have to just focus squarely on winning. But what good is winning when we are not a virtuous republic? What good is winning for the sake of winning when we forget that Sam Adams, one of our founding fathers, one of the ones who was the most outspoken in the formation of this great representative republic of ours, said that we must always be a virtuous republic, that our politicians as well as our electorate must be people of virtue. You see, when we divorce ourselves from this and when we refuse to learn from the mistakes of the past, we find ourselves repeating that past over and over again to the point of it being ad nauseum. And therefore, we, as a nation and as a people, must take a moment to reflect upon this in an objective fashion in order to truly free ourselves from this vicious cycle or vicious circle that has been gripping us for well over a century now. Of course, that is not something that we like to do. We don't like to ask ourselves these prodding, soul-searching questions that make us uncomfortable, that require us to say, hey, maybe we're going about this all the wrong way. But that's exactly what we must do to avoid the mistakes of elections like that of 1912. Now, the general election of 1912, we saw that the presidential campaign was bitterly contested. Vice President James S. Sherman died in office on October 30th of 1912, less than a week before the election, leaving Taft without a running mate. With the Republican Party divided, Wilson captured the presidency handily on November 5th. While Roosevelt was campaigning in Milwaukee on October 4th, 1912, a saloon keeper named John Flaming Schrank shot him. But the bullet lodged in his chest only after penetrating both his steel eyeglass case and passing through a 50-page single-folded copy of the speech he was carrying in his jacket. So you see, even then, the contentions that were gripping the nation were such that it was boiling to the surface. The American people were in a highly contested election cycle. The American people were worried about their future, and they were turning to these radical positions because, believe it or not, the economy was in a panic at the time. And so, again, some of the same messages that we've heard reiterated throughout this 2016 presidential election cycle had come to the forefront some 104 years ago. Now, I know it may sound like I'm repeating this, but it is so important to recall that these things continue to be the same concerns that face us. We are not that different than we were some 104 years ago. Yes, technology is a far cry from what it was. Yes, we have the ability to think and hear for ourselves at a much greater and more rapid pace today than would be imaginable in 1912. That said, we are facing the same challenges. We are facing the same political machinations, and yet the salivating mainstream media is attempting to paint the progressive movement of the modern era as some new thing, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Progressivism was a failed ideology that had started in 1912. It's just as wrong in 2016 as it was back in 1912. And the fact that we are still facing this specter just speaks volumes about how stubborn, for lack of a better term, these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists really are. They are doubling down on their efforts because they think they have accomplished much more than they have ever been able to in any past election cycle. And that's thanks due in no small part to the twisted machinations of this disastrous and monstrous Barack Hussein Obama regime that has plagued this nation for nearly a decade now. And it appears that no matter what selection is made in the 2016 presidential election cycle, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. That we are going to see yet a third term of the Barack Hussein Obama regime come hell or high water. Why? Because if you recall, during a town hall meeting throughout the primary process of 2016, when asked by Jake Tapper at CNN what he thought the most important aspects of government are, or rather the most important duties, obligations, but above all, responsibilities of the federal government are, Donald Trump, the GOP nominee, answered that he believed that it had to provide health care, housing, and education. Again, these are right out of the litany of pet causes put forth by the so-called progressive movement. The same sort of thing that Roosevelt was attempting to push with his Bull Moose Party. But of course, it is nowhere to be found within the clear and concise language of our shared United States Constitution. Reason being is it's simply not there. It is not the duty, obligation, or responsibility of the federal government to provide those things. That is something that should be left to the individual popular sovereigns. That's what charity is for. But we see that charity is under attack just as religion is under attack in the United States of America. We find that these nefarious forces are working nonstop to fundamentally, permanently, and dare I say irreparably transform the United States of America away from being a constitutionally endowed, federalist, representative, Republican form of government to some frothing at the mouth, Fabian socialist, leftist dystopia. So the dreams of those disparate factions are still there. They're still trying to exponentially increase the power and influence of the federal government at the expense of we the people. And that's why it was such a heated and contentious election back in 1912. Now, here is another aspect of it that ties into the 2016 election. We know that those who are pushing for a tyranny of false unity are claiming that those who go out and vote for a third party, or those who go out and vote for an independent candidate such as Evan McMullin, are actually giving Hillary Clinton a vote. Well, back in 1912, the impact of the third party vote was indicated by the fact that while Taft carried 2 states, that of Utah and Vermont, Roosevelt had 6 and Wilson 40 by the electoral vote. There were few states carried by a majority of the popular vote. Taft carried no state with a popular majority. Roosevelt carried 1, that of South Dakota, where there was no Republican ticket, and Wilson carried 11, all the states of the former Confederacy. More than 2/3 of Wilson's total vote was cast in the 37 states that he did not carry by majority vote. So what we see is that the basic third-party contentions here, that of the Bull Moose Party, had simply created a plurality. It didn't just hand it to Wilson, it also basically almost handed it to Roosevelt. It's not that it was a vote against Taft so much as it was for a vote against the system. That is what we're seeing begin to play out again in this 2016 presidential election cycle. Again, something that just cannot be swept under the rug. But of course, the pundits on the right want you to think that that's how it's going to be, because again, that is how they want to control the entire narrative. But again, it shows that these contentious political positions have not changed in the past century, that we are facing the same sorts of arguments that failed back then and which will surely fail again today, because they are not rooted in the natural law tenets, which are by their nature timeless, meaning they're just as applicable today as they were at the inception of this nation some 235 years ago, as God willing they will be some 235 years from today. Now, I know that that may seem disconcerting. I know that that may even sound like it should be an argument for voting for Trump as some lesser of two evils. But what it goes to show is that in 1912, you really didn't have a lesser of two evils. And again, in 2016, you really do not have a lesser of two evils. You are facing the same sort of contentious style of election today as you were 104 years ago. I wish that there was a way around that. I wish that that weren't the case, but folks, it is the case. And therefore, if we are ever bad at the prosperity, we are actually going to have to take a step back and analyze this in a clear and objective fashion. Because once we do that, then we know what steps are necessary to proactively maintain and safeguard our fundamental and inalienable rights, which were endowed to us by our Creator, who happens to be none other than the God of nature himself. Now, I know, again, that this is far easier said than it is done, but it must be done, because no one else has the capability, the wherewithal, nor the endowed authority to do so other than we the people. Because, again, it was we the people that formed this nation and our system of government. Of course, the media will not want to focus on that because, again, they want this progressive agenda to go forth. And it's important to note that back in 1900, William Randolph Hearst, who was the father of yellow journalism, that owned the largest media conglomerate in his newspaper conglomeracy at the time, they were pushing for him at that time of 1900 because that progressives saw this as the perfect opportunity to cement their twisted and diabolical machinations. So we see that it has played out in election cycle after successive election cycle, garnering the same results each and every time. That it is ultimately detrimental to the nation at large, that it works against the best interests of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people, and that it has illicitly allowed the government to further divorce and distance itself from the supreme law of the land, our shared United States Constitution. These things have been repetitive. These strains are still there. They continue to play out, but at an even greater pace and with an even greater impact in the modern electoral system and the modern system of polity than even at the time of the turn of the 20th century. So over this past century, we must continue to face the same dark demons that we did all those years ago. But how do we overcome it? How do we as a nation and as a people come together and say enough is enough? The only way that we can do it is through our vote. And if the Republican Party continues to embrace these fanatics and these individuals who have no inclination of following the supreme law of the land, that of our Constitution, then we must think about other alternatives to the Republican Party. This is why I say that there ought to be a group that goes forth and lobbies for our best interests. And of course, the best interest of which I speak is none other than the Constitution. We need a group of people that goes back to the construction or composition of our Constitution. Now, we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have labeled this as the constitutional compositionist movement. In a way, we have to do what the progressives have done in 1912. And yes, it will play out in a way that may be divisive and may harm us for 10 or more years. That being said, I think for the greater good of the nation, this is the sort of position that we must take. This is the type of position that will free us from the corruption. Because if there was one thing that Teddy Roosevelt was right during the 1912 election, it was that the GOP had been mired with corruption. That was what the American people were frustrated with respect to the party. But we also have to admire the stance that was taken by William Howard Taft in refusing to step down, irrespective of the sort of pressure that was being applied to him by some of the other party bosses, because he wanted to stand up for our representative Republican system of government. He thought that the progressives were a threat to the social foundation as well as the political foundation of the United States of America. And folks, I think he was absolutely right to take the principled stance that he did. Now, Taft was not all that great in everything that he did. He was not a true constitutionalist, but at least he understood the Constitution well enough to know that it should be protected against the diabolical machinations of Theodore Roosevelt. He understood that our nation needed to have a leadership that was willing to stand up for the rule of law. Now, yes, Donald Trump has paid lip service to that time and again in this 2016 presidential election cycle. But that does not mean that he actually believes it. When you stop and analyze what he's done and what he actually believes, you must come to one inexorable conclusion, that he has not once ever truly stood up for any meaningful thing within the Constitution. In fact, by his own fruition and by his own mention, he has said that he has not once read the Constitution from cover to cover because he didn't find any inherent or any intrinsic value within that sacred document. It's part of the reason why Jeremy and I cannot, in good conscience, support Donald Trump. He doesn't support any of the things that we hold in the highest esteem and with the most respect. He doesn't believe in restraining the power of government. In fact, all of his policy positions, in so much that you can claim he even has policy positions, are based on exponentially expanding the scope, application, and reach of government. But that's diametrically opposed to the foundational image that our founding fathers had dreamed of at the inception of this nation some 235 plus years ago. And unless and until we are willing to admit that this is a major problem and is not in the best interest of the Republican Party, then we are going to continue to see these dangerous and twisted things ail and afflict this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. There's no way around that, folks. And again, this is why we say it is of the utmost importance to foster that fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution and thereby your fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. Because in so doing, you gain the ability to stand up for yourselves. You gain the ability to tell these charlatans and hucksters who wish to irreparably transform the United States, no. No, you cannot have my nation. No, you cannot transform my nation without my consent. You cannot turn your back on the natural law tenets that underpin our nation and our system of polity. So what we're doing here, folks, is literally attempting to empower you in your capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this nation. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send our flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. Folks, she will not end any friendships with you. She's just there to pour some alcohol. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I invite you to leave them either here on our YouTube page or our Google Plus page or on Facebook. I also invite you to follow us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, our Blogspot account where we include audio-only versions of our state-of-the-art radio program, and you will also find the Cafe Press account. At the Cafe Press account, you'll find all sorts of trinkets and goodies from hats, shoes, clothing, tote bags, watches, clocks, drinking glasses, shot glasses, you name it. It has either our traditional Radio Aviation Excellence Wright Flyer logo on it or our first class passenger logo on it. And with such a wide array of selections, you're sure to find something that fits your needs at a reasonable price. Go ahead and check that out, folks. You can also find it in our description here on the video, and you can subscribe if you haven't already. We would really appreciate that. Thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer, folks. We'll see you again next time. Do take care.